Perfect. So just a second. I cannot see my notes that I have. Yeah, might be great speaker, but I think I should have a few notes. Just a sec. Perfect. Okie dokie. So welcome. Welcome to Facing Facts and Finding Feelings. So tonight we have a wonderful, wonderful speaker series. We've got Candace Knoll and Parker Johnson joining us. Thank you so much for coming in and joining us this evening. You are in for truly a real treat. So before we start, I do want to make sure that we acknowledge that right now I'm coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. And I invite you all to think about what it means to be living on the unceded and occupied lands. So my name is Alicia Fahrner, and I'll be tonight's moderator. So this is the agenda for tonight. We got lots of things, but it's very exciting. So moving on, tonight we are facing facts and finding feelings. So this is a two-part education session. So it means today, February 9th, and next week, February 16th, where we'll be joined again by Candace Knoll and Parker Johnson. And this is talking about exploring inclusion, diversity, and working towards anti-racism. So by hosting this education session and sharing resources, we hope that you can all become better allies and support the Black community and start thinking critically about our world around us even more. So, what is Black History Month? I thought we should give a little preface before we start. What is February? So, Black History Month is an opportunity for us to celebrate the many achievements and the contributions of Black communities and Black Canadians and our communities, mix that around, who have contributed so much to history and culture in this country. The role of Black Canadians in our communities across Canada has been largely ignored in large part in Canadian history. So in December of 1995, the House of Commons officially recognized February as the Black History Month in Canada. This was following a motion introduced by the first African Canadian woman elected to Parliament, the Honorable Jean Augustine. And so this year's theme for Black History Month is February and Forever. So celebrating Black history today and every day. So by focusing on recognizing the daily contributions that Black Canadians have made in history and make daily in Canada. And so, as you may have heard beforehand, we have on the news by Eclipse, a wonderful R&B rap artist. And now we will be listening to Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem by Jarrett Johnson and Alvin Chea. So just a second while I get that started for you all. Okie dokies, and lift every voice. Now you can hear it on my phone. Let me try that again on the computer. Just a second. Okie dokes. Let me just quickly stop sharing because we are having a few issues. Oh, now you get to see my beautiful notes again. Stop share. And I will play for you now the Black National Anthem. So Lift Every Voice and Sing by Jarrett Johnson and Alvin Chea. And again, my phone, just a second. Again, technical issues, right?
Sing, lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory.
Beautiful. That was, takes my breath away each time. And we are back with our my notes again, session. Awesome. All right, so now we're moving on to the great talks. So before, I want to preface that there will be a Q&A session after each talk. And so you have little chat functions. And so in the Q&A session, make sure to ask your questions throughout the talk, and you can upvote the questions that you like the most. And then after that, I'll pick them out and I'll read as much as we can. And yeah, so keep in mind, Q&A is after each talk. So Candy will give her talk first about racism is a virus, followed then by Q&A, and then followed by Parker and his anti-racism and respect and inclusion at work. And then that will be followed up again with a Q&A. All right. And just before you thought, oh, we're getting his amazing talks, educational talks, no, we are in for even more. There will be prizes happening at the end. And so what will happen is I will advertise the prizes at the end, and there will be prizes this week and next week as well. And at the end of our educational session, the series, your either New Westminster District Labour Council or the Vancouver one will be sending out emails to the winners, and then you will get your little goodies. So we have to thank first Pink for Thursday, Marshall Williams, and he was able to give us some amazing 5 t-shirts, and then we have a few other goodies as well. But for now, I will let you know that this session is videotaped, and there is also closed captioning for those who need it. Yeah. And so, of course, we have to thank, just a second, we have to thank the Vancouver New Westminster District Labour Council for both hosting these events, but also their support and organization. And additionally, this event is supported by the National Congress of Black Women Foundation. And they are an organization which continues to promote and facilitate activities and programs that foster the advancement, recognition, health, and education of Black women and their families. The British Columbia chapter was actually established in 1984, and it was recognized by 1992 as its own registered nonprofit organization. Since then, the organization has continued to promote and facilitate plenty of activities and programs that foster the advancement and recognition, health, and education of female and female-presenting African descendants and their families. So as well as challenging and dismantling systems of oppression and racism. So please do donate to the National Congress of Black Women Foundation to help strengthen their alliance and, you know, keep their movement going. So we also want to thank a big thank you to Melanie Kaur, who has designed the poster and, oops, my goodness, who has designed this amazing poster and has done all the communications for our event. And as I said beforehand, excuse me, I misspoke, Mark Williams, the creator of Pink for Thursday, who will be giving away t-shirts. Okie dokes. And with that, we are on to our first speaker. And so this is Candace Knoll. And Candace Knoll is, oh, excuse me, my notes. Just a second. My apologies. I want to get this right. She deserves all the accolades, so I need to make sure I get all of her credentials correct. Okie dokies. So Candace. Candace is a TWUSW Local 1944 Unit 51 member, a past chair, currently a shop steward counselor, a member of the Civil and Human Rights Committee, the Bargaining Committee, and the USW National Anti-Racism Working Group. She is also a New Westminster District Labour Council delegate, a former board member and a PAC member, a Joy Langdon Women in Leadership Scholarship recipient, and a 2020 Elsie Award winner. Candace has over 20 years of extensive labour training. A life member of International Training and Communications, she has served as the president of the Pacific Northwest region, achieved her skilled communicator status, and is a short course trainer, and has planned third in the is placed for third, excuse me, in the International Speech Contest. She has been part of the communications training group for the Miss BC pageant for over 10 years and has had the opportunity to train contestants that MC, my goodness, sorry, the MC, the Miss Africa Vancouver pageant in 2017. And as a treasurer for the National Congress of Black Women Foundation and a member of the Anti-Racism Coalition of Vancouver and organizer for the Junior Black Achievement Awards, Candace is passionate about taking the skills she's attained to educate and promote advancements for the betterment of her community. And this is her second year partnering with the new Westminster District Labour Council for Black History Month. So with that, I hope you're looking forward to Racism is a Virus. And let me just end this and stop sharing so you can listen to Candace. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. And I'll just take a moment here to share my screen with everyone. And for optimum viewing, if you just look up at the top hand corner, I guess where it says more, if you pick the side-by-side and the speaker view, that's probably the best view for the presentation. So again, thank you, Alicia, for that very warm introduction. Members and guests, welcome to Black History Month 2022, Facing Facts and Finding Feelings. Canadian Senator Dr. Wanda Bernard has a theory that if our government and all Canadians are serious about tackling racism at home, then it's time we started treating this oppression like the health crisis it truly is. Dr. Bernard is the first Black Canadian to have an academic tenure position and become a full-time professor at Dalhousie University. She is a highly regarded social worker, educator, researcher, community activist, and advocate of social change. Her research is on anti-oppression and diversity, and I'm very pleased to present this mini education based on some of her work. Race is a socially constructed way of judging, categorizing, and creating differences among people. Racism is a virus. Racism can also be impacted by violating human rights on such grounds as color, ethnic origin, place of origin, religion, ancestry, or creed, for example. Through the Human Rights Act, our individual cultures and beliefs are recognized, and these rights should protect us. We all bleed red blood, and not one group is superior to another. So to focus on race allows for racism and racial discrimination to exist. To further complicate a situation, racism can overlap or intersection with other human rights grounds, such as, let me just change, I think I went a slide ahead. Give me one moment here. There we go, okay. So it can intersect or overlap with other human rights grounds, such as age, sex, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, marital, family status, generic characteristics, or a conviction where a pardon has been granted. And this can create a unique or compound a situation. According to Dr. Bernard, the way that racism affects health, our well-being are drastic, understudied, and it goes way beyond the healthcare system. Can you imagine living with the everyday experiences such as the feeling of hopelessness or being there as someone's number count, a token, or the feeling of worthlessness and being alone. I have personally experienced microaggressions and know your place undertones. And at times I felt as if I was being looked at as if I were the angry Black woman in the room that was hard to deal with. We could talk about dehumanizing experiences. How about being followed around a department store for no other reason other than your race? Would you not find that uncomfortable or humiliating? In 1966, Selwyn Romley at the time was the 4th Black law student to attend UBC. In 1974, he became a provincial court judge, and then in 1995, he was appointed the first Black Supreme Court judge in BC. Well, did you hear what happened to the retired judge just last year, 2021? He was detained and handcuffed by Vancouver police officers that were looking for a suspect that was half his age. The judge was on his regular morning walk along the beach in Vancouver. It's shameful that 46 years earlier, Velmont Romley, his brother, who went on to become a provincial court judge, was hauled into custody and falsely imprisoned by 3 Vancouver police officers. They were searching for someone who looked nothing like him. During his arrest, he told them he was a lawyer. They didn't believe him. In fact, they laughed at him. But the positive that came from Judge Selwyn Romley's unfortunate incident was the creation of $225,000 in scholarship donations for Black students to attend UBC's Allard School of Law. This was the beginning of exciting and meaningful opportunities for some people in my community. It truly was a success story. But now I want you to imagine some others' realities, perceived possibilities, and options. I want you to visualize the face of a racialized elementary student the moment that they realized that they were in a situation that no one wanted to sit with them or play with them just because of how they looked or sounded. How do you think they feel? How do you think they felt? It can be heartbreaking for that child. The start of self-confidence issues, to say the least, or perhaps influence the choices that that child makes as they go through life. Racism can create a health crisis. The opportunity for advancement, the quality of education, as well as access to affordable housing are all contributing factors that will determine the overall success of a racialized group. As a member of the National Congress of Black Women Foundation, I am very pleased that we are developing this relationship with labor. Also working towards changing the cycle, the establishment of the Junior Black Achievement Awards Society is to offer hope, possibilities, and options for a better future by providing educational programs and scholarships and awards to the youth in the Black community. As chair of this newly founded group, I do hope that we're able to partner with Labor and work with this initiative to enhance the quality of lives for the youth, our youth, and their families. Our website's currently under construction, but I'd say within the next 6 months, you will hear from us. It's really important to support these community initiatives because not only does racism operate on an individual level, which stems from conscious, personal prejudice and unconscious personal prejudices, it's reinforced by systemic, structural, institutional, societal, and scientific racism. Policies, practices, and decision-making processes based on racism are flawed. The formalized set of institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within a society that place one or more social or ethnic groups in a better position to succeed and disadvantage other groups. So ultimately, over time, social disparities will develop between the groups. Laws and regulations made through a society or an organization can lead to issues such as discrimination in the criminal justice system, employment, housing, political power, and education, among other issues. Consider the types and the numbers of interactions that racialized people have with the police. What is likely to happen is more incarcerations of racialized people, which gives them a criminal record, which limits their opportunities. Once you're down, chances are you're going to stay down. Sentencing is also different for Blacks. They represent 3% of our population and 10% are in our prisons. Through practices and policies, an organization can create a culture or they can perpetuate a position of relative disadvantage for racialized people. Ensuring fair and unbiased decision-making by involving people from a different range of backgrounds and of different genders or sexual orientation, for an example, will offer diverse and equitable representation. Councillor Trish Mandawo, the first Black woman to be elected as city councillor in Coquitlam, was, I'm proud to say, politically endorsed by New West and District Labour Council. As a diversity and inclusion strategist, she recognized the need, founded, and is CEO of Synergy on Boards. Synergy on Boards is a consulting group that is dedicated to creating a pool of experienced Black, Indigenous, and other racialized groups that are board ready for organizations to have access to. Having representation at the table offers diversity, equality, and inclusion, which provides a greater opportunity for overall fairness to be achieved. Racial discrimination can occur through stereotyping and overt prejudices or more subconscious ways. One of the most extreme cases that came to my mind is the Tuskegee syphilis study. It was the 40-year human experimentation in America to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in the Black male population. The pseudoscientific practice used race to reinforce racial biases. For example, African men were seen as uniquely fit for enslavement due to their physical strength and their simple minds. Or another example, Black people have a primitive nervous system, so they don't experience pain like white people do. Is that why Black women have a higher mortality rate than white women with the same medical issues? I attended our moderator for tonight, Alicia's presentation on Black Mamas Lives Matter. She presented this at New Weston District Labor Council a few years ago, and it was fabulous. It was a great presentation. Well, in this presentation, Alicia identified, and she talked about this issue using the Serena Williams example the day after she gave birth to her daughter by cesarean. This demonstrates how medicine dismisses Black women. In Alicia's education, she also talked about Dr. Sims, who's known as the modern godfather of gynecology. His contributions included revolutionary tools and techniques to the medical field, like the modern day speculum and the Sims position. Dr. Sims would perform his experiments on Black female slaves without the use of an anesthetic. He practiced from 1835 to 1849 in Alabama. We have also learned that as many as 30 different types of experiments were performed by German physicians on concentration camp inmates in 1945 during World War II. In 1947, the World Health Organization published the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a set of ethics and principles regarding human experimentation. It was developed for the medical community, and it's regarded as the cornerstone document on human research ethics. Now, even though the Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in December 1948 to provide for the rights and freedoms for all individuals, the Tuskegee experiments continued until 1972. So it was 40 years of human experimentation. We are still in a world of unrest. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, to respectfully name just a few of those unjustly taken. Are you familiar with that human experiment that's being done today to demonstrate white privilege? Where people line up in a row and then they advance forward or backwards, depending on the answer to their question. Well, I never did like participating in that experiment. I felt as though the racialized people in the room were once again being singled out to demonstrate and educate the privileged. And when having that conversation in some cases, I felt as though my thoughts were dismissed at the suggestion that this was a racially discriminating exercise. I felt as though some of the responses were of a defensive nature, while others sounded like they were wounded, as if maybe even a little angry, as like that I would even suggest such a thing. But you know what? Those are some of the typical symptoms of white fragility. I was reading an article the other day. It was written by Constance Gray on Vox.com. It was written June 30th, 2020, and it was regarding the term BIPOC. Some activists have responded to the acronym as an attempt to center the voices of Black and Indigenous communities. But actually, by using this term, it indiscriminately carries its own problem. Adrian Dixon, a professor of critical race theory at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, says that this is an attempt to include or to be inclusive of the histories of oppression. But terms like BIPOC come with a loss of nuance. People want to be named and recognized, not part of an amalgam. By doing this, you're erasing the differences. For an example, the genocide of the indigenous people versus the enslavement of the African people. Although we're both victims of colonization, our issues are different. White privilege exists. By facing facts and acknowledging that it stems from colonial and societal beliefs, you can stop the cycle by caring enough to recognize and find the feelings to take actions that will make a difference. As a society, we must all work together to eradicate inequality and injustices. We must all work together to change the cycle. Racism is a health hazard. And in the words of Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, let's treat this oppression like the health crisis it truly is. Racism is a virus. Alicia?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Candace. What an enlightening talk. I learned so much, and thank you for the shout out. That was, and if you have any more that you want to know about Candace's talk, we will be sending out resources coming on later on. So look out for that. And let me just check the Q&A. Perfect. So, one of the questions by Janet Andrews is, so this is to Candace, obviously, there are cultural and racial trainings in law enforcement in the United States. Do you feel that we need more of that here, given the examples that you were giving, Candace?
Sorry, I just wanted to write that down. So just to reiterate, she said there are cultural and training and forces in the United States. Do we feel that we need that here?
Cultural and racial, yes.
One of the things that I was reading about a little while ago was it had to do with like first responders. Although it's not cultural and training with the law enforcement, what I found to be really interesting, and it may very well work between Canada and the States, is in Seattle, I believe what it is, there's a group. They're like the first responders. So when something is happening or going awry, instead of the police being the first people called, the first responders are. They get in there, they make an assessment of which resources would perhaps be better tailored to the occasion versus always it being the police. Perhaps the police aren't ready to deal with this mental issue that may be happening, you know, in a community type idea. So I think thinking in terms of what's going on in Seattle and crime and responders and law, and I just think the Black community is so largely affected. Maybe a model similar to what that is could in fact maybe help to alleviate some of those injustices, assumptions that could be better addressed by the proper people taking care of the situation. So I'm sorry, I don't know what that model was called. I read about it a couple of years ago, but as far as taking notice of what the states are doing and could we do something? Yeah, I believe that we can, because we know that in the States, it is a larger problem than what we have here. And it's only because our numbers are not as large, but the problems exist and we can learn from there. So thank you, Janet, for that. And Parker, did you want to add anything into that?
No, I think that the other thing that occurs oftentimes is because US media is so ever present that oftentimes we're not as aware of the issues that confront Black Canadians in this context, and the deaths and the ongoing challenges of systemic racism. So I do appreciate what you said there. And unfortunately, I think Canada also uses the US as a "we aren't as bad as them" justification, as opposed to "we can be better" as an aspiration. So yeah, that was a great answer. I have nothing more to add. Thanks.
Well, thank you for both of those answers. That was really great. And I definitely agree too. It's sometimes we look a bit too much to our southern neighbors and not enough on us. But with that, let's move on to Parker Johnson and his talk on anti-racism, respect, and inclusion at work. So thank you so much, Candace, for your wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you, Candace. And I want to apologize. The respect and inclusion at work will be next week, but the one that I'm going to do today really does dovetail in some ways with what Candace had done. So I'll just share this. Where is it? Where does it say share screen? There we go. And so all right. So I wanted to start off. So what I'm going to talk about is solidarity and doing better. Systemic racism, intersectionality, and Canadian innocence. So it speaks to a little bit of what we were talking about before regarding Canada and the US. And I want to start off with a quote from Toni Morrison that some of you may be familiar with as well already. And, you know, it's one that I find to be helpful and insightful. So the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps us from doing our work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on that fact that it is. Somebody says that you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says that you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. I wanted to bring that out because I find Toni Morrison to offer a lot of insights into the way in which racism shows up in our lives. And another thing that she'd shared, which I thought was particularly insightful, was the idea that that race has primarily two functions. One is, in the mind at least of the racist, and structures of racial discrimination, is to serve as a psychological tool to justify one sense of superiority and to justify subjugating the other. But the other is that it serves as a profit motive. And within the context of capitalism and enslavement and all these things that we know about. And Morrison's notion was that if we can get rid of the psychological use and the economic profitability that people engage in, then we can actually probably do something. But until then, she said racism is going to continue, which I thought was interesting insight. The other thing that shows up, and I want to mention this too in the context of truth and reconciliation. I know in the Canadian context, we talk about this as focusing on Indigenous people here, but that conversation actually began with Indigenous people in South Africa. And so there was a poem by a poet named Lucille Clifton, and it's something that I think sits at the core of some of the ways in which racism shows up. And she said the poem called "Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes." They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. And the efforts to subjugate folks using race is that tool, especially when we look at what happened with Indigenous peoples in the context of residential schools, and also the denial of access to education and various ways in which Black people in particular were subjugated and subjected to segregation and other tools of dehumanization and oppression. That was a practice to try to get us unmoored from who we are and our notions of where we came from. And so the importance of remembering is always critical, to know where we came from, to know who we are and where we're going. And within the context of this, it's also a tool, an opportunity for us to practice compassion and empathy. And oftentimes when trying to get people to understand these issues, the notion of empathy will come into play. Cognitive empathy, meaning our intellectual awareness and understanding, or affective empathy, meaning how do we engage in terms of our hearts, our feelings, our emotions. And so these things I think are really critical when we're talking about how to bridge these issues. And as James Baldwin said, we can't change things that we don't face. And so learning to listen and believe when people share stories that don't match our experiences, and also to lean into these conversations with vulnerability, which is courage, connection, and compassion. And so I just wanted to set the context for some of what I'm going to talk about. So with the notion of Canadian innocence and Canadian identity, there are a few things that I just want to go over as someone who came here from the US and find myself here on these unceded, occupied, and stolen land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in East Van. Settler colonialism was one of the key learnings for me about how Canada was formed. It's a settler colonial state, and the ongoing way in which capitalism continues to make our experience here difficult. So I do want to say up front that racism is a virus, absolutely. And we have capitalism, we have colonialism, we have patriarchy and other forms of oppression, which are interlocking. And I'll talk a little bit more about intersectionality in a moment. And so when we're looking at things like white liberalism, which oftentimes is us needing to focus on centering the experience of white people, which is what, the context of racism and white supremacy is always trying to make sure that they're not afraid, or they're not uncomfortable, or that they're concerned about uncertainty or addressed. And so oftentimes it becomes an issue of, and as Candace said before, you're being discriminated against because you're Black. And I would also say we're being discriminated against when people are talking about racism, because people have racist beliefs, and in terms of the ideology and the practice and the behaviors that fall from that. And so I would say that I'm not necessarily discriminated against because I'm Black, but I would say that because my Blackness doesn't cause discrimination. Or as James Baldwin said, what makes you think that you need an N-word? And so since I'm not that, the choice to be racist is really sitting squarely in the responsibility of the person engaged in the behavior. And so Canadian identity, I think, and this speaks to the way in which we locate ourselves in relationship to the US and also the world, is a Canadian exceptionalism, the niceness, what I will call conflict avoidant behavior of Canadians and Canada, always saying, at least we're not the US, not actually wanting to engage our own history with slavery, our own history with colonialism, genocide, our own ongoing challenge of not collecting data and looking at in a responsible way what's happening in terms of racial oppression in this country. So another way in which that shows up is colorblindness and tokenism. So people say, oh, we have a Black person here, we have an Indigenous person here, and we hire the best person. We don't see color, as if seeing color is a problem versus denying people's humanity based on racist beliefs. So it's not color that actually is the problem. It's the behavior towards people based on the assumptions that misinform them and their racist practices, beliefs, and behaviors. So oftentimes when I talk about, when I'm particularly having worked in the US and also in Canada, worked for City of Vancouver for 10 years in the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. And then I worked also at BCIT. The issue has never been color blindness, but being color conscious and being able to challenge our own biases. And within the context of organizations, the myth of multiculturalism and assimilation continues to be a pervasive thing. So people are oftentimes brought in and say, you need to become Canadian. And yet still people are dealing with the microaggressions of, where are you from? Oh, you speak well for X, or many of the other ways in which the assumption of the other and othering of folks is a constant thing that happens until people see, well, if you just behave in this way, and oftentimes people will talk about what can be referred to as respectability politics. If you behave in a particular way, then you won't be subjected to police harassment. And people will say, well, I was dressed and I was still subjected to vicious harassment. And again, behaviors that we engage in, certainly people are always trying to reduce the probability of being harassed and targeted. But as we know, the problem doesn't lie with the target, it lies with the agent. And so assimilation is a form of what I would call social violence as well. And so we need to be able to challenge that. And also meritocracy, the myth of meritocracy, that people aren't being promoted because they have networks of relationships, and also because of structural bias and all of these things. And oh, we just happen to have our leadership is mostly or all white. It just happens to be that way, as opposed to, well, no, it's a structural thing. As Candace earlier mentioned, there's an ideology that informs that. And the notion that we got there based on our individual merit, oftentimes people will say, you, particularly for racialized folks, you'll have to work twice as hard to get half as much. And that in and of itself speaks to the notion of disproportionate access, disparate access to opportunities. And I won't go into the rest of this, but reverse racism is another thing. And then the ongoing centering of whiteness. These are some of the things that we're constantly having to deal with as we're addressing issues around racism. And the notion of, particularly of reverse racism, which isn't a thing, it doesn't actually exist. So there's an interesting article called Detour Spotting, which I really encourage folks to look at. And these are some of the ways in which people will try to avoid talking about race. So as I mentioned earlier, the notion around colorblindness, the notion around individualism, and if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, then you too will succeed. It doesn't mean people should not work hard and shouldn't achieve, but we also need to deal with the structural opposition that we're encountering. And then people will say, well, if we do these things, that's reverse discrimination. And it's as if to say the cure is the same thing as the problem. Again, we're dealing with false equivalencies here. We're trying to resolve a situation where people are saying, well, then we'll have to do quotas. And then when you look and say, well, what got you into a 90+% white organization, or all of your leadership is white? That actually, if we're talking about quotas, then we're actually trying to break the quota, which says that the leadership needs to be white. Or the leadership needs to be male. So actually we're trying to break that quota. And it's come up interestingly with a lot of the conversation down south about having a Black woman be on the Supreme Court, but there was no conversation when it was all white men. And when someone asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late justice at the US Supreme Court, what percentage of the court should be female? She said 100%. And people were like, well, why, how can you say 100%? She said, well, it was 100% male for a long time. Why not? So it was interesting, it's interesting what we see and don't see because of our assumptions around what is quote unquote normal. Then we've got the other form of racism that shows up in terms of white savior, the notion of tokenism, which myself having, I remember when I was the first person to lead a group of campers. I worked for a Y camp. The first person who was not white to lead one of these trips overseas on international camper exchange program. And I remember coming back and telling one of my white colleagues, who was also a counselor at the camp, that I'd been asked to lead a trip. He said, "You just got that because you're Black." Thought to myself, well, actually, I got this in spite of the fact that he's only been hiring white people to do this. So no, it's not because I'm Black. It's in spite of the racism that I got this opportunity. And we need to do something to break through that. But the logic that informed him was a sense of entitlement, and when all you've known is privilege, equality seems like oppression. So, and then the credentialing by proximity, oh, I have a Black friend, or I'm married to so-and-so, and all of these things. And these are other ways in which we avoid or create assumptions around racism that are unfounded. So some quick definitions. I know that people probably know all of these things already, but I find that common language is very important in talking about racism. So many of you are probably familiar with the writing of Robin DiAngelo and the notion of white fragility. And there's some key components around that and the individual notion around what is racism. So the dictionary definition being prejudice, discrimination, antagonism towards someone based on race and the assumption of racial superiority. Again, here they don't necessarily say white racial superiority because it could be any race, but within a global context, we're usually talking about the construct of what is considered to be whiteness as a racial construct. Also knowing that race has no scientific validity and it's a social construct. So I assume everybody also is aware of that. So the notions that DiAngelo talks about are the notions of individualism, and which means that I'm a good person, so I couldn't possibly be racist. A racist is someone who's consciously hostile, aggressive towards people based on race or their sense of racial superiority, and it's intentional. And I'm never going to intentionally do these sorts of things. So people are able to wrap themselves in these notions around what it means to be racist. So if you're not intentional, it's not a conscious choice, and and because you're a good person, you couldn't possibly be doing these things. Oftentimes, the defense becomes very evident very quickly, and rather than getting curious, people get dismissive. They start to defend, deflect, all of these things. And so systemic racism, and Candace talked about this a little bit earlier, is informed by things such as critical race theory. It's also, as I mentioned, race is a social and political construct, not a scientific one. And that it's on several different levels. And I have a short slide that I'll just mention here. And some of the work of Ibram Kendi, his most recent book about how to be anti-racist is quite good. And one of the things he talks about is racist is one who is supporting racist policy through actions and inactions, expressing a racist idea. So racism really is about an ideology, and within this context, really about a system known as the system of white supremacy. And so the sort of the four levels of racism that I often talk about the systemic level. So on a societal level, what's happening, and how does it happen within interlocking institutions? So when people talk about the criminal justice system, or as I would argue, sort of the criminal legal system, because there is no justice within the context of that system, there are interlocking structures there. So people will talk about, for example, the school to prison pipeline. So how do the schools operate in ways that then act as feeders for the prison? But then the interlocking frameworks that happen also within, as Candace was talking about, being policed while you're in a store, or also people being policed or over-surveilled in the workplace. So these structures interlock, and they uphold through racist policies and practices. And then it'll show up in institutions, whether we're talking about unions, talking about schools, we're talking about workplaces, what have you. And then there are also the dimension of interpersonal interactions. So the microaggressions, ways in which racism will show up, and then internalized. So internalized, people talk about internalized inferiority or internalized superiority in terms of how racism can show up in a societal context and in ourselves. So I do want to read this one quote, which I think is really important because of looking at the Indigenous context of this conversation. There's a great book called Unsettling Canada by Art Manuel. If you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to check it out. And one of the things he talks about is the doctrine of discovery was the tool, the legal fiction that Europeans used to claim our lands for themselves. The Americas were first portrayed as terra nullius, or on European maps. But in almost all cases, Europeans were met at times within minutes of arrival by indigenous peoples. The doctrine of discovery remained because it is a legal fig leaf they could use to cover naked thievery and the ongoing colonial project of removing the people and taking the land. And so we see the ongoing push for land back. And as we are seeking Black liberation in many contexts across the globe, including Canada and the US, Indigenous folks in the North American context are also seeking Indigenous sovereignty, and important work there. What was being mentioned before about, by Candace, about some of the different terms, which I think is really important, different human rights terms, also have to do with intersectionality. So what people are doing now is oftentimes using them as identity markers, and they're not identity markers, they're structural markers of systemic oppression. And it comes out of a case actually affecting a Black woman in the Detroit auto factory. And it's, the image here is of Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the legal scholar who wrote a great article and from which the term was coined. And what it focused on was a case where a Black woman said, look, you're not addressing my needs. I'm being discriminated against based on race and gender. The employer at the time said, what do you mean? We have Blacks working here, and pointed to the men who are working on the assembly line and in various types of roles. Said, and we have women, pointing to the white women who are working in support roles and other types of roles, often, again, very stereotypical ways in which it was constructed. And so this was a structural blind spot or missing piece of the puzzle that they couldn't actually understand, because dealing with overlapping issues of structural oppression and structural discrimination. And so that might show up, for example, in the context of, say, a trans woman or a queer person with a disability or a gay man of color. So we're talking here about, sexual orientation, discrimination in terms of heterosexism and racism, or cissexism in terms of the trans woman and racism. And so there are different ways in which these things can show up, but it's not simply a term for multiple identities. I'm not going to go to that last slide, but there is something I do want to talk about briefly here with regard to racism. It has to do with intent and impact. And oftentimes people want to talk about their good intentions. And I don't disavow that oftentimes people do have very good intentions, but we have to deal with the impacts. So, the example here is when one drops a plate on the ground. So did it break? Yes. Now you say, oh, sorry. Did saying sorry help to repair it, put it back together? No, not really. And so people need to understand that when, particularly in the work that I've done, when people will come to make complaints, they aren't complaining about people's intentions. They're making concerns about the impact of the behavior. So just one last thing here, a couple last things I want to mention. In shifting our focus to be more focused around anti-racism, it's really important to be able to move from a fixed notion of comfort to a growth notion based on courage. And so, I don't know where to start or what to say. Well, we need to do what we can to educate ourselves, to read, to learn, to listen, to speak up against injustice. I don't want to get it wrong or get called out, or people fear being called out or called in. Well, we're imperfect, so we have to know we're going to make mistakes. We need to learn from them and not continue to make them on the backs of others. I won't make a difference. What can I do? Nothing's going to change. Well, that's surrender, and that's sort of giving up. Things happen when I take risks and become part of something bigger, which is what unions are, which is what communities are, and so on. And I don't get involved in politics. I don't have time. Well, politics are here all the time for us. And so human rights issues, these are human rights issues, and they matter all the time. And so we have an obligation to ourselves and to each other to stand up. These slides will be made available to folks. And so those are some of the key things that I wanted to cover. But just to finish up, I'll just mention a couple of these things around being actively anti-racist, to disrupt racist practices, and to get comfortable calling things out and also calling them in. And so calling them out is a sort of public thing. Calling someone in is more of a private conversation. And also being able to suss out what will be most appropriate in which situation. Also organized around issues and addressing things. In some cases now, people are doing some important work with community aid and an organization and different organizations like Congress of Black Women and so on, so that we can continue to do things that address, amplify, and support change. And for me, doing that and moving toward Black liberation is an ongoing struggle for the work that we do. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.
Realize I'm at time.
No, you're good. Wow, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Parker, for that educational, informative talk. I just wanted to highlight beforehand that you are also a group facilitator, a mediator, culture educator, and organizational change specialist, committed obviously to building just, equitable, and diverse and inclusive organizations. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Are we ready for some questions? Perfect. Let me just get them. Okie dokies. So one of the questions, oh, yes?
Oh, Parker's just got a screen. There we go.
No worries. All right, so one of the questions was, so of the 4 dimensions of racism, do you feel that one is more urgent to address than the others, understanding that all are necessary?
I think in any situation, it's important to deal with what's immediate. So if I'm in a public space, for example, and I'm experiencing racial harassment, or I see someone else experiencing racial harassment, I want to do something to intervene in that moment to support the individual. But then also there's the larger context too, to think about, is this a workplace? Is this public transit? Is this so, to make sure that people are aware that this thing has happened, and that there's organizations oftentimes that have to have oversight of that. So if it happens in the store, and a person who works at the store is, say, surveilling me while I'm going around trying to make a purchase, I can certainly talk to that person and say, you need to stop. But I also need to talk to the store manager and say, you have some accountability. And I could take that up if I wanted to, particularly if it's a chain, to let the people who operate the organization, like what happened with Starbucks, for example, when they did their sort of nationwide training around anti-racism, which anyway, which is more symbolic than substantive, but it did happen. But I'm just saying that oftentimes we can go into those levels, but I think it's most important to deal with the immediate, urgent thing of what's in the window. Yeah, if that makes sense.
And another question that just rolled in. So our school district is creating an anti-racism policy. What would you advise we absolutely include?
Well, with anti-racism policies, people need to have procedures and practices in place for training people around what racism is and how to intervene. So I think something that will be really important will be around teacher training and training of school officials, so that they're aware of their responsibilities to create an anti-racist and racially inclusive climate. And that the other thing that folks need to know about, because it's an educational context, what's the curriculum? What are the things that are being taught? What are the things that are not being taught? How are people dealing with the notion around the socialization of folks in the context of school that are supporting an anti-racist and inclusive school context? Who's being affirmed, who's being supported, who's being lifted up, and you can see all of these things too. So what's happening structurally, so that Black History Month isn't just 28 days, but it's a year-long ongoing process of learning. And so these are some of the things I think people need to deal with: the curriculum, need to deal with staffing, need to deal with policies and procedures. They need to deal with the employment retention and promotion, so that they have people throughout the organization, and they need to deal with the content of the curriculum as well. So those are some critical things. And how are they going to assess its improvement and its impact? Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. So how should white people try to navigate the balance between self-education on racism while listening to Black voices without crossing over to expecting them to do the emotional labor?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question, as the other questions have been as well. I think it's really important for white people in terms of dealing with racism is you want to do your work, do your reading, all of those things, but also respect people's boundaries. So when people state a boundary, you need to respect that boundary rather than say, yeah, but. And so if someone says, that's not something I feel comfortable dealing with, just listen to them and don't try to have them justify or explain and all of those things, because the burden is significant. And the other thing to pay attention to is to know how to step back, so that if you're in a meeting in a conversation, you're noticing that white people are dominating the conversation and there are people of color present, then you need to make sure that there's space there and to disrupt those conversations. And similarly, if you hear a racist remark, rather than doing the silence of white solidarity around those things, then to step in and say, you know what, that's inappropriate, that's racist, and challenge folks around that. Because what has happened to me, and it may have happened to others as well, is people come up afterwards and say, wow, that must have made you feel really uncomfortable. I'm sorry that happened. It's like, well, maybe in this moment, you need to step in, use your privilege, speak up, step up, rather than coming to me afterwards and say, oh, that's really unfortunate. Because I know it was unfortunate, but you need to talk to the person who was engaged in the behavior. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you for that. Again, concluding both talks, thank you so much. It was absolutely wonderful. I know I learned a lot. And so in keeping with time, we shall move on. Just a second while I share my screen. Dokies. And again, oh my goodness. There we are. So I would like, can you see the Q&A as well? Let me just get rid of that just in case you can. Okay, perfect. So we wanted to highlight one of the businesses in our community, and that is the Real Patty. So the Real Patty was actually created during the pandemic and has since been thriving. They offer a wide variety of Jamaican patties, including vegan options, and they're situated in Abbotsford. The Real Patty delivers across Metro Vancouver. So check out their website and Instagram at The Real Patty. And we will be giving away 2 $25 gift cards. So again, as I said beforehand, we'll make sure that all the winners will be announced after our session next week. Right, oops daisies. And the next one is Pink for Thursday. So Pink for Thursday is, oops, my goodness. The founder, Mark Williams, created it, and Pink for Thursday is an initiative which aims to serve as a reminder that bullying in all forms is unacceptable, whether in a school, organization, or personal lives. Nobody is immune to bullying. Any person can be affected, young or old, citizen or immigrant, high-paying executive, or frontline workers. Their goal is to create greater knowledge of access to resources for those who are experiencing or have been witness to any form of bullying. And so they will be giving away 5 t-shirts. And so if you do win, make sure to take a picture of the shirt, share your favorite quote or thoughts on what bullying means to you, post on social media, and make sure to tag Pink for Thursdays to be featured on their social media. And as we heard beforehand, for some folks who maybe came in a bit late, this is Eclipse. Marshall Benjamin is tonight's featured artist, a hip hop and rap artist who's also known as Eclipse. And you may have heard his or you have the chance to win his latest album, Out of the Dark, Into the Light, and a few shirts. So again, winners will be announced later on. And to have a closing session, we will be listening again to his song On the News, which was specially produced for Black History Month. And before we do so, I just want to let you know that next week's topic, now it's a bit different, but so next week's topic will be, next week's program will be on same time, Wednesday, February 16th, 6:45, and we'll start at 7. And then Parker Johnson will be giving his talk on anti-racism and inclusion at work. And then Candace will be giving her talk on dismantling and challenging racism. And so that's pretty much it. But you know how to register. Make sure to email above if you haven't already. It's a very exciting program. And before we leave, I just want to again thank the New West and Vancouver District Council Labor and the National Congress for Black Women. Oh, yes. For their support and for organizing this event. Yes, Candace?
I was just going to say, Alicia, I noticed on the patties, it's Eat the Real Patty.com. Okay. So just forgot about that eat, and I would not want people not to find him because they are good.
Oh, that sounds exciting. We'll have also their information on our resource list, which will go out to all registered participants. So make sure to click the link there. And as you heard from someone who's tried it, and I've tried one too there. Very, very good. Treat yourself every once in a while and support a Black business while you're at it. So as I said, thank you so much for coming. Next week's topic will be our last one for this two-part educational series. And as I said beforehand, winners will be announced later on after the series next week. So look out for that in your inbox. And from now, we will be listening to On the News. Thank you so much for joining in, folks. And let me figure this out first.
Thank you all.
We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police.
No more living life suppressed. It's on the news now, but you don't see it every day. They on the loose route. And plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away, it's on the news now. But you don't see it every day, they on the loose route. Plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away. Give me the loot, better freeze before they shoot. Get on your knees, begging please like a little prostitute. Get on the ground, don't make a sound, put your hands up in the sky. Or I release the dogs if you choose not to comply. Did everything they said cause they didn't want to die. Then they slammed it to the ground and cut off cause their supply. They was sworn to protect us but can't even respect us, got us chained up. But by the gold and the necklace got me fed up. Speculating like we reckless, time to stand up. We must proceed when they won't let us. Black lives matter, even more a black queen. We're on the shot in the sleep, they saw black, not human beings. On the news now, but you don't see it every day, they on the loose route. And plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot loud. And blow your ass away, it's on the news now. But you don't see it every day, they on the loose route. Plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot loud. And blow your ass away. Damn, the 30 years since it beat Rodney King. Martin Luther King Jr. never saw his own dream. Jacob Blake shot 7 times, right in his back. Get her ass every day just for being black. Tomorrow Rice was just a kid playing with the guns. They know just what they did. They can't where he was from. Take a father while you are women to try to keep us down. Take that style of music and culture and roots are in the ground. It ain't just in the States, this shit happens all around. Go ask indigenous people, anyone who's skin who's brown. Colors, life matter, built the cities off the back. Tell me where you gonna run to when we take our cities back. It's on the news now, but you don't see it every day. They on the loose route. And plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away, it's on the news now. But you don't see it every day, they on the loose route. Plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away.
Juan McDonald, Garner,
Edward Brown, Tatiana Jefferson,
Bonnie Rice,
Fernando Castillo.
Murderers of women and children. How you think that make you tough? And you playing the victims of the system when times are rough. Native women and children missing, you ain't doing enough. Should be saving our children and I catch us instead of murderers of women and children. How you think that make you tough? And you playing the victims of the system when times are rough. Native women and children missing, you ain't doing enough. Should be saving our children and I catch us instead of enough. It's on the news now, but you don't see it every day. They on the loose route. And plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away, it's on the news now. But you don't see it every day, they on the loose route. Plus they know the way you say they got that juice now. Cause they squeeze every day, come back and shoot now. And blow your ass away.
All lives matter, but you got to think about who dying out here.
Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and have a good evening.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you all. Take care. Thank you too.
Later.